This presentation is actually based on several papers which are joint work with Enrico Marvasi, Giulio Vannelli, Chair Zaki, Rima Iadi, Velia Bigi, and Elena Perra and Michele Mancini. So there are a lot of people here which have contributed somehow to what I'm going to say on this presentation. The outline is the following. I'm going to try to answer some questions. The first question I'm going to try to answer is whether we have entered a phase of deglobalization. Shingal, and especially answering to a question that Marco Sanfilippo asked before, we're discussing about these issues of deglobalization. So I will review the recent trend in the global economy for that. Then the second is whether we can actually see how we measure the crisis, the COVID crisis, and whether we can actually see it in countries of the South Shore of the Mediterranean. And I will give you some evidence, basically using some maps. And then I'm going to go into the global value chain. The main question here is whether the global value chain and the COVID crisis are negatively correlated, whether more open countries measured by integration in global value chain are hit harder than other countries, countries which are less open to trade, and whether this relationship is actually affected by the position along the global value chain, i.e. whether the countries have backward linkages or forward linkages. So I'm going to look a little at the GVC dynamics during the COVID crisis for some countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, Italy, whatever. I'm going to just show you some of these countries. And finally, the fourth question is the one that I think Shingal was addressing, which is what are global value chain retrenching? Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide some evidence, which obviously is not very solid because we don't have many data on that, but on firms level. So the idea is whether there are firms, they're not countries that internationalize through global value chain. So to see whether the firms change their behavior in the COVID crisis. And of course, this will bring me to some speculation on the debate, to speculate a little on the debate on reshoring, nearshoring, along the first wave of the COVID-19 crisis, and what are the possible opportunities for the Mediterranean countries. So, as I said before, I will review first, very briefly, the recent trend. Now, what you see here is a graph which was in the World Development Report 2020, which is a graph which has been also used by Paul and Truss in a recent paper. And this shows the GVC share of global trade along a long period of time. What you notice here is that the slope of this is very high up to the crisis of 2008, and then it goes down. So GVC share of global trade increased substantially up to 2008. What happened afterwards? Why we didn't repeat in this increase? Well, because the emerging countries were actually are now in 2008 were very integrated in global supply chain. We saw some examples with China, Vietnam in the paper by Shingal. We basically know this. So I don't think we can repeat much in global value chain trade unless Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, actually joins the game. Sub-Saharan Africa so far has been quite at the border of this globalization. There was no further decline in transportation and communication costs, which are the ones which have triggered the increase in global value chain trade here. There is a reversion of the trend of reduction in protectionist measure, which was very high in the first way here around when China joined the WTO and subsequently, while here after the crisis, countries started re-protecting. There was also something else, which was that automation increased and 3D printing, and this could have favored this globalization or deglobalization. Basically, automation could be thought of an alternative to offshoring, and there is some literature on that. And of course, the 3D printing as well, because then you can produce what you need, even though you need to import some imported inputs in order to produce, to actually think. There is another debate, which I'm not going to discuss, which is on blockchain, but that takes us too far away. One thing that everyone sort of agrees on nowadays and in this graph, I plotted the GVC output growth relation in blue and the world trade cycle in red, is that the global value chain are pro-cyclical. So basically, in a period of boom, they fuel growth, while in period of crisis, they demultiply the trade impact. And this graph here is a similar one to the one before, but just focus on the end of 2019 and 2020. What you see here is that with the COVID crisis in March 2020, you really have, and even before, because the crisis started in January and February in China, but in March, you really have a downturn of the economy. So here, this is February to March, the decrease in China, and here you have a real drop in the world industrial production and in the world trade that go hand in hand up to April and May. What is interesting is that this is only the first wave of the COVID crisis. There is a very rapid recovery, which is the one that we have seen over the summer, basically. But even though here there is a recovery, the trade elasticity had decreased since the global financial crisis and did not pick up. So basically, if we want to answer the first question, and we enter the phase of deglobalization, I will go with the Paul Antras wording. Paul Antras speaks about globalization, and he says globalization already started in 2008, 2009, and the COVID crisis has just added to this situation of globalization. So we cannot speak really of deglobalization, but we can see an economy, a world economy, which is much lower than it was before. Of course, we can. The first thing to ask is how can we measure the extent of the crisis? And as we all know, the economic data lag behind. It's true that the trade data are monthly and before revision, so we could, to a certain extent, look at some monthly data, but a lot of all the GDP data and so on and so forth, they lag behind. So one thing I want to show you, and I will be very brief on that, are some maps. Why do I use maps? Because the night light and the emissions are available basically daily, on daily frequency, and very soon after they're released. And they can tell us whether we can see a crisis or not. So I'll show you some maps. This, for instance, is Tunisia. And on the left, you have the NO2 variation and the night lights instead on the right. And then you see here in Tunisia, you see, especially in NO2 variation, we have quite a large decrease in, which is about 29% decrease in few months of the NO2 emission, especially in the touristic zone. The same is about Morocco. Morocco, you see, this is the the Tangier area is the one where there are global value chain, and that's the one which has had a significant drop. Minus 39% in the NO2 variation, in NO2, and also in the night lights. The same applies to Jordan. In Jordan, this area, which is the one most affected, is the area which is the most touristic area, while instead, for instance, Amman doesn't seem to be affected at all. Egypt, even more. This is a very, very large reduction in the NO2 emission, 55%. So basically, my answer to Q2 is, which was, can we see the crisis? I will answer yes, we can see the crisis. We have a sharp reduction in emission, a sharp reduction in night lights in the South Shore countries. We can do the same for the North Shore countries. I don't have maps here, but we have computed the mobility with the Google mobility data, and we have the same results as far as our countries are concerned. And we all know because we were in lockdown. What is true is that the South Shore country are at less of a lockdown than we had in the North because there was more of a curfew rather than a lockdown. But anyway, now this data could also be used to predict GDP reduction. We have done it in a paper with Velia Bigi and Elena Perra, but I'm not going to show you this GDP reduction. They're very similar at the end of the story to the data that the IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank have for the GDP reduction of these countries. The only country that does not have in the prediction, in the forecast, a reduction of GDP is actually Egypt, which is counterintuitive for our results. But now the third question was, which countries are more affected by the crisis? Now, in the great financial crisis, which is my reference point in a lot of studies, the more open countries, the countries which were more integrated into world trade, were hit harder. So the question I ask is this also true now, or is this crisis different? And the way I measure openness, there are several ways, and in other research, we have measured it as openness to international trade. The way I'm measuring it here, because I'm interested in global value chain, I will measure it as global value chain related trade. This is a graph where you have a lot of countries, and basically here you have the GDP growth forecast for 2020, and here you have the GVC participation. And you see that there is a negative correlation between these countries. This, of course, is a negative correlation, is less than in previous crises, but you cannot see the countries. So I'll show you this one, where we have Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, France, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. I took out some of the countries in order to focus on the one we are interested in. What I want to show you is that really what we have is that countries which have basically very similar participation in the GVC are actually affected in different way in terms of the IMF growth forecast. So there is a negative correlation, but there are substantial differences amongst countries. So the answer to question 3 could be, well, there is a negative correlation, is lower than in previous countries, but especially in previous crises, but especially is different, is heterogeneous across countries. What can we look at now? Well, this is because I'm interested in global value chain, I try to look at several indexes which are correlated to the global value chain. Now, if you look, for instance, at the South Shore I consider here are Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia, South Mediterranean shores, and Italy, Greece, Spain, and France as North Mediterranean shore, North Shore in the Mediterranean. You see that the South Shore are less integrated than the North Shore of the Mediterranean, beside Tunisia. Tunisia is a case on its own, and they tend to be concentrated upstream, so they have a higher concentration upstream. And this is crucial to identify what is the exposure to economic shocks through the global value chain. Basically, I'll show you the graph because it's simpler. What do I have? I show you two graphs. One is the percentage of value added, which is originated abroad, which is absorbed in countries. And here is the value added, which is produced, which is absorbed abroad. So these are two different ways to measure the country foreign exposure. And what you see here, for instance, you see a country like Spain, which is exactly on the 45-degree line, while you see countries like France and Italy, which are below, and therefore they seem more, basically more exposed on the origin of value-added side. Sorry, on the production, on the supply side, while the other seems to be more on the origin side. This graph is this on the y-axis, there is the total value added foreign exposure, i.e. the sum of the two axes in the previous graph. And here you have the average partner GDP contraction. So we computed why we computed the average partner GDP contraction? Because each of these countries has different trading partners. So if you look at something like that, you see, for instance, Jordan is has a high value added exposure through the lowest. But the GDP contraction of the partner of Jordan, which is more integrated with the Middle Eastern countries than is, for instance, Tunisia, Morocco, can offset this total exposure to the value of the value added. While Tunisia has a similar exposure in value in terms of value added if you add both the origin and the destination to Jordan, but the partner contraction in Tunisia has been much higher. So Tunisia has been effectively hit much worse than, for instance, Jordan or Morocco, because the partners contraction, the GDP contraction in the partners has been much higher. Of course, this is just at the country level, but these are not countries that integrate in global value chain, they are firms. Now, so we wanted to look at the firms in global value chain. Data here are much more difficult to find. So what we did is there is the World Bank Enterprise Survey. They have done a COVID-19 follow-up, which was delivered in September 2020. And this World Bank Enterprise Survey have 3 countries in the COVID-19 follow-up that interest us, which are basically Morocco and Jordan and Italy. Italy is actually the only North Shore country which is in this COVID-19 follow-up. The others are in doing. As far as Italy is concerned, I will also show you a couple of data from a Bank of Italy survey because it's much more detailed on the kind of things that I wanted to show. The others just give preliminary analysis and we wait for better data. So basically, the main question here we want to ask is whether firms' strategy changed after COVID or not. And therefore, certainly what we know is that firms had to address differently the trade-off between efficiency and risk management. And so what are the possible strategies that the firms could actually take, as discussed in the recent literature? And some of them also were discussed by Shindal in his presentation, which was, however, at the sectoral level and not at the firm level. Well, the firms could close down plants. They could relocate, for instance, to regional value chain with a shortening of the value chain. They could diversify the sourcing. They could reshore. On that, for instance, there is a very good data set on EU reshoring monitor. Unluckily, this stopped in 2018. It will be really good to have the data for 2019 and 2020. But mainly, most of the debate, the policy debate, is on reshoring, at least in our countries. Now, these data give sort of some indication. If you look at Morocco, for instance, you have here, this is in this graph, you have the percentage of material inputs and supply, basically the foreign inputs in 2013, which was the year of the previous survey for Morocco of the World Bank Enterprise Survey, and 2019, and the same is for Jordan. For Italy, there is no 2013, unluckily, so we cannot make a comparison. But you have a drop in Morocco, which is really, really strong. And if you go and disaggregate it by sectors, you have that in textile, for instance, you have a very strong decrease for both Morocco and Jordan. But in mechanics, which is more the inputs in mechanics are more sophisticated, you don't have it. So you may actually have, in Morocco, you may have a results at the aggregated level, which depends on the aggregation of the sector. So you see, for instance, here in Jordan, you have an increase on material, on foreign inputs imported in the mechanics sector. If you look at the sale, and this is a little bit more, is interesting, you look at the firms, not at the domestic firms, but at the importer and exporters. In Morocco, you see that firms, international firms, firms which are importers on the left and exporters on the right, they seem to perform better. The decrease in sale is slightly smaller for Morocco here. This is 82 and the other one is 80 point something. And also, most of the sale remain the same. More sale remain the same. The same happened for exporters. The data are not so clear if you look at Italy, for instance, because they are a little bit confused. So for Italy, I'll show you some data of the Bank of Italy. The survey asked whether firms close or intend to close over the next year. So had they closed plants in the last 3 years or do intend to close in the next year. This is interesting. This survey was administered to the firms in September 2020. So this was after the first COVID crisis, so including the first COVID crisis before the second. The firms in general, only 2% of the international firms have reshored their production. So this is about 1.9%. And about 5% of Italian firms are considering of doing it in the next year, but most of them are not. The question asked on the number of whether firms have reduced the number of foreign suppliers and increased and substituted them with domestic suppliers. So a question which is exactly on the reshoring is very interesting, because about 80% of firms did not reduce the number of foreign suppliers, and only 4% intend to do it in the next year, or consider that they could do it in the next year. So you see, Shandal was speaking about the resilience of a global value chain. He was speaking about that with aggregate sectoral data. Here we see it with the firm data. There seems to be a resilience. Firms do not want to change their foreign suppliers, maybe because the specialization is such that they have tasks which are very specialized, and therefore it's very costly to change a supplier. Yes, I will finish. I got the message saying I should finish. That's it. Basically, let me just say that there is an ongoing research on the regional value chain, which we are doing, especially which sectors could be interesting for regional value chain, including North Shore and South Shore of the Mediterranean. And basically what I want to say is that the COVID crisis is different from the previous one, and the hints that we get from the firm, well, I mean, Shindal said things which we also got in some results, which I didn't show you, which is that the service sector are more affected. But also that what I show you is that Italian firms are not changing much their sourcing and production choices. And also in Morocco, international firms seem to perform better. They are not penalized by partner GDP reduction. And the same applies to Jordan, which I also had some data. So basically, I think the one thing that we should ask ourselves is how to mitigate the procyclicality of global value chain. And here we could speak about diversification, and we should include some analysis on network centrality to see what are the main hubs and shock propagation mechanisms, firms to firm, microdata. So that's basically my presentation. Thanks.